Alright, so here's our second animal. In this case, I've got a kangaroo here. So with this particular set, what we're going to be focused on, or at least what I'm going to be focusing on, is more the surface transition. So previously we were looking at forms, we're looking at the form transitions insofar as our shapes, right? Keeping something really fairly simple in terms of a shark. This time I want to look a little bit more about the surface transition as well as the proportional breakdown, that is, how big certain parts are. So let's start with sort of the overall size again. So just like before, I'm going to start drawing exactly what I see, or roughly what I see. And so I'm going to rough out the body. So if I look at this overall breakdown, I kind of mark it in, I can see that the leg is about half of the body. So if I have this body here, I know that the leg is going to sit somewhere there, right? There's probably a little bit more to go forward with the body because it's on a little bit of an angle. So it's maybe not quite half, but this still gives me a nice start. This comes down, and there's probably a section over here that rises up. And I can start to put roughly marking out where the leg is towards the front. That's hanging along here, and I can also start to look at the overall height of this in terms of where that back where it arches up. And it looks like, if I mark it in, I think it's about half, right? So if it's about there, then we're looking at something about there. So it looks about half. My feet kind of come forward a little bit. And the feet kind of run up about, let's say, not quite halfway, just a little bit shy, something there, maybe because of perspective or just the way that the animal has evolved. That's kind of just what it looks like. So legs are there. We know that towards the front here, the arms come down and the elbow sits a little bit lower than here, right? A little bit there. So as you can see with the way that I'm approaching this version, it's a little bit more systematic in that I'm kind of breaking things down, but I'm still more or less keeping things pretty loose, right? I don't want to slow things down. I want to keep things pretty loose, and I can tighten them up later on. Okay, my main focus is just on the big elements. I spoke a little bit before when we were doing the shark, which is when someone's walking down towards you, right? Well, let's say they're a couple of 100 meters away from you. You don't really see much. Right, you don't really see much of that person. You just see mostly the large shapes, and that's what we're really focusing on now. I'm trying to keep things relatively loose. Right, I know the ears kind of end up being a little bit higher than this, something like that. And of course, we have the leg on the other side. That this really falls down like right there in the middle. We know that the rump comes here, and there's the tail that's going to fall through. And roughly where it is, actually it's a little bit above the ankle, just from the way that the perspective of the camera is sitting. Something a little bit like this. Right, so this time around I'm using perspective to help, not perspective, sorry, the proportions to help break it down. And this gives me a rough skeleton of what I'm seeing. So now that I have my rough skeleton, I can go into this and start to figure out, well, what is that form transition in that from one surface to another? Because I'm not doing this as blocky parts right now. I'm doing this as more of a complete animal. So in this case, I'm just going to tighten this section up here. In terms of form, we have a look at this. That kind of rides up. Right, if I just delete this, it kind of comes down, and it's probably going to go into a pocket there before coming up here again. So I'm almost, in this case, contouring this creature, right? This animal. The ribs are going to push out a little bit to the legs. Seems to be some form of knee joint here, or the approximation of a knee joint. That's going to come down. So I'm looking a little bit more about how the joints or how the forms flow into each other. Again, I don't want to get too lost in details. I just want to get these big elements in. Looking at the legs. Coming down. This would be the center line. Oh, divot back here. Right. Abdomen is going to pop up behind. This is really mostly the rib cage. Not worrying about the fur or anything right now. I'm just looking at the form. So now it's a little bit of a bend, right? The back, this part is kind of as a side view almost. That bends a little bit, and we're going to see this sort of puffiness that comes down for the torso of the kangaroo. As I mentioned before, when we were doing the or finish up on the shark, this one is predominantly going to be focusing on the proportions, but it does have elements where it's going to bring in our surface transition. Definitely later on when we move on to the eagle, we'll do the eagle after this, we're definitely looking at that transition because of the type of forms that we're getting. I think the eagle makes for a good example, or a good, a good example where we can focus on that a little bit more. Now, the wallaby, or sorry, I think this is a wallaby. I don't think this is a kangaroo. It's not exactly what we see in the image, which is fine. It's not, our job right now when we're doing these studies, these sketches, our job is not really to copy this or to replicate this one for one. Right? Our job is to try and understand, if I need to draw this thing again, if I need to understand how this thing moves, right? That's, I want to understand that stuff, right? To be able to redraw it again, to be able to take this and redesign it into a different creature. My job, or my main priority, has nothing to do with drawing exactly what is being present here. Let's have a look at these ears. Kind of rolls down. Let me have a look at this. Okay, so it looks like overall the way the back is positioned, kind of flows like so. We're seeing more of the top of the back of the ear. On this side, don't really see into it. Get the overall sort of skull structure of our wallaby. Neck probably reaches down there. So now we have kind of like what we did before, that first iteration, which is really looking at really drawing this and using that particular process to break it down. So the next version that we do is, what if we redrew this in a different perspective, right? So I'm going to go ahead and kind of shrink this down a little bit. And this is really what studies are all about. We're trying to look at something and we're trying to understand how it works, right? Visually, how it works. Not interested in trying to get a beautiful finish. We're more interested in how, what is it that I'm looking at, and how do I actually draw it again, or how do I better understand it? So same process. I'm looking, referring back to the knowledge that I gained from up here. And I'm going to start to kind of figure out, actually before I even do this, maybe what I could do is I could figure out where exactly the base of the feet would sit. Maybe something like this. Put the towel back here. And from here, I can start to kind of work out, okay, well, if this is about halfway up that I want, then I know that whatever body that I'm using, following the rough perspective, doesn't have to be perfect, the body's probably going to be there, right? This kind of lines up quite well with the center of the spine, right, where that hump is. So if I were to go in and start to block that out, it's going to give me a pretty close approximation to the overall shape that I'm after. Right? Again, following a lot of the same, I guess, forms and proportions I have up here. I can start to sketch. Now, right now I'm doing kind of one version of each, right? One version pretty simple, following the camera. Now I'm doing followed by a second version where we're changing the camera, right? I'm doing this once, right? This is the context of this demo right here. But if you are practicing at home, you don't want to just do it once. You want to do this a lot. If you're very serious about wanting to get better at concept art, wanting to really kind of master, or not even master, but to get very confident in being able to, not only just to draw, but to get pretty confident understanding, like, why the hell am I doing studies, right? What are the benefit of studies? You want to do these things multiple times, right? It's not a one and done sort of thing. It's very easy to think, okay, well, I just do this once, and now that I've done it once, I know it. And it's true, like, you can do this once and you'll know it, in terms of you know exactly how to deal with, let's say, kangaroos. But what happens if you need to change to another animal? Or what happens if you need to do this, let's say, 3 weeks from now, and you might have forgotten exactly what you needed to do? So being able to do it multiple times, it reinforces that knowledge. Now, I have no idea how the tail actually works towards the back, right? Because that information is not there. Again, as I'm studying this, I should go online and I should find, let's say, an image of a koala, sorry, not a koala, a kangaroo from the back, to see exactly how does that tail work. I've seen enough kangaroos in my life that I have a pretty good idea. It's going to slope back. The tail's a pretty hefty part of a kangaroo. Although, while I've seen a lot of kangaroos, now I'm thinking about it, I think this is probably the first time I've actually sat down to draw a kangaroo. It's not really one of those things I've thought much about drawing. I draw a lot of bears and lions, horses. Yeah, I don't really. Actually, I think this is the first time. Yeah, I think this is the first time that I'm drawing a kangaroo. Now, the way that this works, again, I'm basing it off one reference image. I grew up in Australia, so you see kangaroos, when you go have a picnic and everything. So you kind of get familiar with the way they move. So the head is here, the spine actually curves back, and it runs along the top, right? Kind of runs something like this. So I'm pulling that based off my sort of, I suppose, lived experience. But if you haven't drawn a particular animal before, jump online, find some more images. All right, it's going to curve up. Now it's going to place the head somewhere here. then of course the ears kind of mapped to that hump for the on the back, which is a little bit in front of where the hips are. So something like this. Right, so let's go ahead and actually start to clean this up. Now, when you're doing these, when you're doing studies, whether you want to do them digitally or whether you want to do them on paper, I think all are fine. I would recommend that, if drawing is still something relatively new to you, or that you struggle a bit with drawing, it doesn't come naturally. Certainly for me, I know that drawing didn't actually come all that naturally. I drew a lot as a kid, but it wasn't an activity that came naturally to me. I'd recommend that if you kind of fall into that category, similar to myself, I would say do pen and paper. Try and draw with pen and paper. That tactile sensation, that sort of feel of carving in the shapes, I think that helps quite a bit. At least personally, I feel that helps quite a bit in building up that understanding, building up that knowledge of forms, like really looking at how to draw things from a form point of view rather than from purely just like a visual point of view. And as far as concept art goes or design goes, that is much stronger or much more useful than just pure drawing skills, right? There is a need for clear communication in design, and so there's a need for having good drawings, right? But first and foremost, that key line that I said before, clear communication. So your drawing doesn't have to be perfect, but what it does have to do is it has to very clearly communicate what the hell it is that you want people to look at, or what it is that you're trying to design. So again, you don't want to get in a situation where someone looks at your drawing and they go, "What is that?" Because if that's when someone says that, it's, as a designer, it's a bit like a stab in the heart, where you're like, "Ooh, okay, you really screwed up." If when someone looks at something, they have to go, "What is that?" They have to ask you, you've definitely screwed up. I don't care how good you are, right? If someone doesn't know what they're looking at, the fault lies with you. It doesn't lie with your audience. And I've seen a lot of people kind of, when people don't quite understand what they're looking at, I've seen a lot of artists kind of lash out at people, saying that they don't understand, or very, very usual sort of ego stuff, and that never goes down well, because our job, we're the professionals. Our job is to make sure that we communicate clearly. It's not the job of the audience to be professionals with this. So that comes down. That spire would run there. And just like before, we have this part over here, right? That's the ribs. I think I might make the legs a little bit more forward. That's that back leg there. Let's kind of get rid of it for the time being. And let's start to sculpt out the front limbs. I was about to call them arms, but I wasn't sure. Like, would they be arms or would they be something else? Now, I think I've made it a little bit too sort of long, I suppose. So I'm just going to take that. I'm just going to move it back a little bit, because they do compress quite a bit. That curvature of their spine, it does compress quite a bit. I got this sort of shoe shape or horseshoe shape there. Let's bring it around to the other side. Again, I do not care about the details whatsoever at this point. I am just trying to focus on the overall proportions to make sure that the proportions line up with what I worked out both here and here, and looking at the form transitions, or at least the surface transitions. And as you guys work and kind of do your own studies, you'll find that no method stands alone by itself. It's often, at the end of the day, it's going to be a mixture of different methods. That's really what's going to carry through your studies. It's never kind of a single element there. Let's do some contouring just to reinforce the narrowness of the body, because it's not too wide. I think it's just, well, I think I've made this part a little bit too wide. So let's just follow that again. Should be back here. And there's the leg. A little bit lower. And that tail's going to come back. Round a little bit of this, some contouring in there just so that it helps sell a little bit more about the shape. Let's get the eyes in there. So number one, number two. So now we go from looking at exactly what we have here, trying to translate that across into reinterpreting this information to feed into a brand new view. Of course, just like before, let's go ahead and do a third version just for fun, because these aren't taking very long. They're quite enjoyable to do. And we'll do a third version where we reconstruct the camera, and we might pose the animal a little. Just going to shift everything across so we just have a little bit more space over here. So let's drop the camera a little bit more, because again, this is kind of a flat camera. This is looking down. We'll do the same thing like the shark, and it's going to have the camera looking up a little bit more. And let's utilize that same process here. Looking at the main body over here. So if I have the leg, right, it's about halfway, about the length. And since this is kind of flat, since we're looking up at it, a little bit of foreshortening. Maybe the other leg is back here. Let's have that there, stretching out. And we're looking up, so everything is a little bit taller. And I might this time curve the animal around a little bit, so that's the main body, curving it around. And I know that the elbows kind of sit about the same area as this. So if there is, let's say, a change in the arms, the elbows are about there, and the arms come down, and they hang pretty close to the ground. And this time I might place it's going to be a neck. The head is about there, because the head doesn't it sticks. At least in this image, it sits about there in this sort of relaxed position that the animal's in. It's not drooping too much. It's not like a rhino or an elephant, that where it droops quite a bit, depending on how it's positioned. And ears coming up. That back section is over here. It's kind of the rib cage that comes up, and we see a little bit of the leg over here. You might see that coming through the other section of the ribs, and then we might have the rest of the legs on this side. So it looks a little bit like a scribble. Let's go in and kind of start to clean this out. A little bit more advanced. I'm still not fully representing this as exactly how it is. I'm still using some sort of shorthands with some of my geoforms to cell things like elbows or joints with these sort of more circular elements. Right, not, again, just to reiterate, not after details at this point, not important for our studies. There is a time and place for details for studies, but not right now. So far, without sort of with these observational sketches or these drawings, we're just trying to figure out what's the, I suppose, what's the most important thing that you can get out of it. Because even if you just focus on the details, you are getting something out of the practice, you are getting something out of the experience. So the question that I'm posing in this is, well, what I'm trying to address is what is more important. What are the, I suppose, the top 3 important elements that when we are doing these studies, we want to look for. Right, so in my opinion, as you know, in the context of concept art, it is looking at proportions. It is looking at the transitions of surface or of forms. Right, it's looking at these things that become quite important. And of course, obviously, building up our visual library. Can I erase that? Gap between the ears is actually not that wide, so that's going to allow me to kind of bring the base of the ears a little bit closer. Not very much like a rabbit's ear. I suppose with the ears, they probably evolved very similar for most animals, at least most herbivores, right, to track predators. Though, as far as I'm concerned, or I'm aware, sorry, I don't think kangaroos have any predators. So I'm not sure why they might have followed the evolution of sort of some of the other more prey animals. Or maybe they did have predators, but they, they died out relatively recently for the evolution not to have kicked in. I suppose if there's no predators and you have this development or evolved state, there's nothing really to force a change either. Anyway, let's get back to what's more important, which is drawing the damn thing. Now, the nose does droop a little bit more. It's almost like it almost has like a deer-like face. Here, this leg, we're not really going to see too much of the, I suppose that's the thigh of the other leg. Let's put that there, and then we might have the actual, let's put a little bit of grass in here, some foreshortening. That's the actual other leg. A bit of foreshortening on this side as well. Of course, following back here, the tail is going to come down. I might see the tail popping out a little bit on this side. And just for visual effect, we're just gonna, or at least I am going to put down a little bit of shadow on one side, just so that it's a little visually a little bit more dramatic. Just to separate out the different parts. Submerge most of that tail in the shadow, just to help pop it a little bit more. scroll back a little bit. Right, but proportionally, we're still looking at roughly the same thing, right? In terms of where the elbows are, to where that transition is over here, the overall height of the ears and the head and everything. You know, how much space does the leg take up relative to the entire length? All of that stuff is still there. So just like the shark, right, we went from looking at this image, looking at this photograph, and drawing really as is, right? With a more, you know, last time was focusing on the forms. This time it's more focusing on a little bit more of the surface transition, right? But more sort of keying into the proportions. And so we have that. Then we take all that information, right? All that we've learned from that iteration, and we're redrawing it in perspective, right? And you know, again, in a very something very close to a 3/4 view drawing or an isometric drawing. And again, taking all the knowledge, all the information that we learned from that process, we're now reconstructing it with a completely different camera and starting to bend the creature or move the creature, give it a sense of movement, right? So I can't stress enough, like, how important it is to have this, to have some form of process backing up the way that you draw, the way that you study things. Without this process, it's very hard to figure out if you're drawing things or if you're trying to learn things. It's very hard to figure out if whether the process that you're using or what you're doing, it's very hard to figure out if you're on the right track or if you're doing something wrong, or to be able to even just identify what part of what you're doing isn't performing as well as you would like. If you're able to break down how you do things with a process, with a very sort of step-by-step process, I know it sucks a lot of the romance and the that sort of I suppose the romance of drawing out from it. But if the intent is to learn, we want to be very methodical with our approach. It can't be a gut feeling, right? Because another way of describing gut feeling is trial and error. And trial and error takes forever because you have to go through all these different permutations to figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work. But if you have a process, right, it becomes very procedural and allows you to knock out things that don't work early on, and allows you to identify as well problems early on, right, without having to redo things or kind of really just go through iteration after iteration. All right, so let's leave this particular section as it is, and the next part that we're going to dive into, we'll look at the eagle, and we'll look specifically at not form transition, sorry, we'll specifically be looking at surface transition, right? How does one surface move or transition into another one? So when we are drawing or we are designing, let's say, creatures, it doesn't look like we're taking, one part of this animal and just stuff